Donald Trump helped make America great again by strengthening the American economy, cementing the USA as the key player in global economics. He oversaw the strongest version of the United States military and fought the war on terror at an unprecedented scale. And not to mention, he forged valuable strategic alliances with foreign powers that helped bolster America's position on the global stage greatly. But how good was the 45th president, actually? Donald Trump came in off a hot new approach to American politics, emphasizing his role as a businessman first and foremost. No more posing for political parties, just cold hard facts, cash, and calculated logic in the White House. That was Trump's promise. And he kept that promise, bounding off of an upset victory against crooked Hillary in the 2016 race. By taking down the Democratic favorite, Team Trump made a massive blow against the establishment political media. He proved that anybody could approach from the outside and win over hearts and minds with a campaign that was focused on connections with the average person, connections with working class people. One of the things that Trump did that Hillary didn't do was make a concerted effort to visit as many US states as possible. Whereas Hillary concentrated a lot of her campaign travel on big urban metropolitan centers like New York City and LA, Trump talked to steelworkers in the Rust Belt and coal miners in West Virginia. His campaign was extremely effective at providing an alternative to the political machine that looked ready to put these workers out of business in the name of environmentalism, or some other esoteric political phrasing. In February of 2016, Trump was put on the spot for a big answer right away: the appointment of a Supreme Court justice, as Justice Antonin Scalia passed away. He managed his time between the media pressing him on the topic while promising victories both domestically and in matters overseas, and he delivered. After appointing the textualist Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, Trump set his sights overseas. 2017. Donald Trump was the most business-forward president ever, and it should come as no shock that the economy did well under him. A key indicator of this was how unemployment sat at a 50-year record low, 3.5%. To put things into perspective, the shipping giant Amazon had 566,000 employees globally by the end of 2017. With Trump at the wheel, their roster would increase by over 40%, up to 798,000 jobs worldwide. Alphabet Inc., the parent company of Google, had about 80,110 people as well. By the end of Trump's term, that number would go up to 135,000, a little over a 68% increase. All possible because of Trump and his economy. He took a sharp look at that and asked, how can I make these numbers even better? This process started with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 reduced the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, having a huge effect on takeaway profits for big businesses like Apple, Wells Fargo, and others, resulting in an explosive surge in the stock market. But the TCJA was just the tip of the iceberg. Trump had a multi-pronged approach to helping companies make tons of money. He rolled back many aspects of Dodd-Frank. The Dodd-Frank Act aimed to make financial firms more accountable. Trump argued it hindered growth. Before his changes, only banks with over $50 billion in assets faced close scrutiny, including stress tests. Failing a test brought public scrutiny, even if the reasons were beyond the bank's control. Trump got on the scene and eliminated all of this. And it's no shocker, considering he would be just the kind of guy who would understand the practical ground game a big bank had to do with all that cash flow. He also eased up on the Volcker Rule. The Volcker Rule barred banks from participating in certain kinds of speculative investments. Operating a bank isn't easy, and you have to swiftly enter and exit positions of financial markets. So this rule made it difficult for them to do their jobs. Trump, understanding the difficulty of operating a bank, cut out some of the bureaucratic red tape getting in the way of their operational capacity. Banks were able to do what banks do, and money was infused into the economy. On the stock market, Trump stated, "The reason our stock market is so successful is because of me. I've always been great with money. I've always been great with jobs. That's what I do." While his economic efforts were at the forefront of his campaign and his strategy, the efforts to reduce regulatory burdens gave companies commanding high stock prices the ability to maneuver in more flexible ways. One example of an industry that was able to command higher premiums was the energy sector, particularly after rolling back parts of the Clean Power Plan. Looser regulations made it easier for energy companies to grow and build more jobs for the United States economy. While Trump was busy with all of this, He was working on other parts concerning the average American's wallets. He cut certain parts of Obamacare that punished Americans for not having health insurance, and he also doubled the child tax credit. The scope and scale of Trump's reforms showed itself not just in the way banks handled their money, it also showed itself in the performance of various production sectors across the entire country, reflecting his image as a business-focused president who resonated with the jobs workers performed. He understood what needed to happen on the books for stuff to get out of the door and shipped overseas. And he also wanted to lean into resources available on American soil that were already working, like coal. Coal is still relied on in many ways, and as such, Trump approved a landmark deal to build a state-of-the-art green coal energy plant in the Lone Star State. The momentum kept going, and in the same year, the U.S. became a net exporter of natural gas due to the leaning on the sales of liquefied natural gas. Liquefied natural gas is more feasible to transport over long distances without a pipeline. So, at a point in which the country was going through a lot of controversies surrounding the building and maintenance of pipelines, it made sense for Trump to lean into this and make a little more money. More LNG production means more sales overseas and more efficient running of businesses here in America, so more stuff gets done more quickly. Trump's plethora of deregulations and the expansion of offshore drilling helped with this. The US was a major oil salesman. Obama-era regulations on methane emissions were rolled back, and federal land could be used for oil and gas drilling. Now, you might feel concerned about the environment, but Trump was making a more calculated environmental bet than you may think. You see, natural gas only emits about half as much carbon dioxide as coal, and 30% less than oil when you're using it for energy purposes. This includes electricity generation, residential heating and cooking, processes in industry like for boilers and turbines, and for vehicles that utilize compressed natural gas or liquefied natural gas. If you live in a big city, you may have seen a bunch of these buses without even realizing it. CNG buses reduce congestion and emissions in cities. Trump's policies supported the U.S.'s position as a major natural gas producer. He was a big fan of coal, too. After all, coal was a commonly discussed topic in his campaign trips throughout Appalachia and Pennsylvania. His loyal fan base resonated with it back then, and still did at this point. From the Blue Ridge Mountains to the sands of the Arabian Desert, Trump moved and shook it up quite a bit in his first year. One of the reasons he leaned so heavily into the energy sector was to get the attention of the Kingdom of Saud. Trump's first trip abroad was to visit the Saudi King Salman. As early as May 2017, the two negotiated an arms deal with a big price tag, a whopping $110 billion, projected for $350 billion over the next 10 years. The Saudis would get tanks, combat ships, missile defense systems, and radar, as well as communications and cybersecurity tech. The US enjoys a lot of trade with Saudi Arabia, and for good reason. Billions of dollars are exchanged annually. According to the US Census Bureau, US exports to Saudi Arabia approximated $10.8 billion. Imports from Saudi Arabia approximated $13.2 billion. Saudi Arabia has a respectable military force, but its main calling card is its economic power. It is a titan. Its oil reserves have made it very rich, and it is the world's largest crude oil exporter. It has the second largest proven oil reserve in the world with over 260 billion barrels. If the Saudis produced 10 million barrels of oil per day at a constant rate, the reserves would last them 71 years. Oil makes up 50% of its GDP, 70% of its export earnings, and 85% of its revenue. It's also a leading member of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and has a lot of influence in global oil prices, settings, and production levels. If you're a slightly pragmatic world leader, you're not going to put yourself in an awkward situation with the only Arab country in the G20, and Trump recognizes the power of alliances like this. He was instrumental in cementing a partnership between the two countries. There were also commitments from the Saudi kingdom to invest in U.S. infrastructure. Specific details were not always revealed to the public, but there were a series of memorandums of understanding, or MOUs, at hundreds of billions of dollars in value across many sectors, particularly matters like defense, technology, and the energy sector. Which, if we remember what we were just talking about, was already going through a massive upswing thanks to the policies Trump helped facilitate. The Saudi Public Investment Fund helped companies like Uber. They're planning to invest in Lucid Motors, an electric car company too. Trump brought in foreign investments to the US with a special eye on Saudi Arabia. He backed out of the Iran nuclear deal to back Saudi Arabia's plans.
President Trump says he is backing out of the nuclear deal with Iran.
Saudi Arabia plays a big role in security around the Persian Gulf, especially in guarding the Strait of Hormuz. This safeguard ensures money for Saudi and oil for the US. The US backs up Saudi security with naval ships. Trump wanted to pump up the economy with deals and jobs from Saudi Arabia. He also aimed to strengthen security bonds. Saudi Arabia was happy to get US military help. His aims grew to include forming strong economic and diplomatic ties, showing his tact for military matters as well. In a speech to US troops, Trump stated,
"We will extend the hand of friendship to any nation that will work with us in good faith on this vital mission."
Trump's efforts against ISIS resulted in an acceleration to aggressively clear ISIS holdouts in Iraq and Syria. More authority was given to military commanders to operate in the region without direct White House approval, to get rid of some of the bureaucratic red tape. It worked for drilling oil, so it ought to work for drilling bad guys. Trump also assisted local armed groups, in particular the Syrian Democratic Forces. The US has provided military support, arms, training, and air support to SDF fighters, and the group still fights ISIS cells, especially in many of Syria's oil-rich regions. The organization is directly opposed to the Syrian government under the leadership of Bashar al-Assad, whose actions have had a particularly abrasive relationship with American interests in this part of the world. Erdogan's Turkish government characterizes the American support of the SDF as abating terrorists. But Trump didn't care. American help was crucial to the coalition's ability to take back the city of Raqqa, the self-proclaimed capital of ISIS themselves. American forces provided airstrikes, supplies, and even U.S. Special Forces in an advisory role. There were several high-profile moments. After a missile strike on a Syrian airbase that was in response to a chemical attack, Trump stated,
"Done more against ISIS in 9 months than the previous administration's done during its whole administration. By far."
Trump suggested a plan to fight ISIS in both Syria and Iraq with the Kurds. The Peshmerga, a Kurdish group, helped the US in Iraq. They number between 150,000 and 200,000 fighters. Trump wisely supported the Kurds. When ISIS attacked Erbil, the Kurdish capital, the Kurds stood their ground. It's a major revenue source and a key trade hub. Trump backed the Iraqi security forces and the Peshmerga with training and weapons. US forces helped retake Mosul from ISIS. They also targeted ISIS's income, especially from oil smuggling. Trump aimed to dismantle the caliphate. By 2017, ISIS was pushed out of Mosul shortly after Trump's first speech. He used US military power to fight terrorism in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Trump even deployed the Moab, the most powerful conventional bomb, from an Air Force jet. This act aimed to impress a geopolitical rival who also enjoys big explosions, or at least seems to. Trump tried to establish a relationship with him early in his term. Rocket Man should have been handled a long time ago. Donald Trump started a diplomatic kickoff with the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, in response to the regime's propensity for sending rockets over the Sea of Japan. After gaining a lot of experience sending rockets across the Middle East, Donald Trump felt it was appropriate to show the little guy a thing or two about them. North Korea has made their missiles a point of controversy with public displays for some time, going as far back as the 70s. So when Trump thawed the relationship by traveling to North Korea, becoming the first US president to do so, he set a new precedent for diplomatic dealings with the Hermit Kingdom. North Korea possesses a number of short-range, medium-range, intermediate-range, intercontinental, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And the country isn't as small as you may think either. It's about the size of a mid-sized US state, Mississippi, for comparison's sake. North Korea has the 4th largest army in the world, with 1.2 million active-duty soldiers. It also has one of the world's largest stockpiles of artillery, with estimates of perhaps upwards of 13,000 artillery systems, capable of aiming right at the capital of Seoul. North Korea has also, perhaps bluffingly, leveled threats at the US, stating they have the capability to cock a gun and aim it right at the US with their own ICBMs. The threat that North Korea poses, even if it's bluffing, is unsettling, to say the least. The country claims a lot of things, particularly in relation to anything that can explode. But what makes recent dealings with this country interesting is the fact that they approached the West for diplomacy, and Trump acted where others didn't. Maybe in part to Trump putting ISIS on ice, Kim Jong-un got out of his shell as the year turned to 2018 and said, "Hey, can we just talk?" He sent a delegation to the Winter Olympics in South Korea. Then South Korea sent a delegation to the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. And then the South Koreans came to the US to tell President Trump that Kim Jong-un had invited him to a meeting. Kim Jong-un met with the South Korean president, Moon Jae-in, at the DMZ, and then Trump and Kim Jong-un met in Singapore. As a matter of fact, they signed a statement placing a goal to denuclearize the Korean peninsula. Details on the meetings were somewhat tight-lipped, but the whole sequence was widely televised and brought up a lot of big questions. Could peace with North Korea be possible? Regardless, there was an effort made, and there were hands shaken, which was an improvement over North Korea's policy of not engaging in diplomatic ventures much at all. While North Korea sure has a lot of artillery pieces, and allegedly missiles, as far as anybody can tell, they don't have a space program. Among plenty of initiatives where the Trump administration was quite hawkish, when it came to utilizing the checkbook for matters of the military, Trump was single-handedly responsible for codifying a unique branch of the U.S. Armed Forces that will stand the test of time, and put his portrait up at the academy from which it trains its officers one day. Donald Trump also oversaw the creation of the U.S. Space Force. It sounds like Star Wars, but in actuality, it's more like Spreadsheet Simulator. China and Russia do indeed have a vested interest in being able to have punching power at U.S. assets in space, like satellites. In 2018, Trump told the Department of Defense to get on it, and as such, the Air Force was given a separate military branch called the Space Force, like how the Marines are a department of the United States Navy. The duties and operations of the Space Force include satellite operations, tracking and cataloging of other objects and debris in space, cybersecurity, and the launch operation of satellites. It's still a young institution, and as such, needs a little bit of room to grow, but it's made a lot of strides. Let's contextualize just how important it is that the US keeps its space stuff in space. Like anything else, there are different satellites allocated to different responsibilities. Advanced, extremely high-frequency satellites are military communications satellites that give secure, protected, jam-resistant comms for the armed forces of the United States and its partners. Your cell phone, if it's on 4G LTE, could have a frequency band anywhere between 700 megahertz to 2.5 gigahertz. A US AEHF satellite can output up to 44 gigahertz for uplink and downlink. The US military also needs to know about the weather and has specific equipment for tracking that. Defense meteorological satellites monitor meteorological, oceanographic, and solar terrestrial physics for the United States Department of Defense. Occasionally, the military will also lend civilian weather satellites too. There are also satellites to track launched missiles, like Rocket Man's, using infrared sensors, as well as space situational awareness satellites, which are meant to track objects in Earth's orbit to make sure we don't get a dinosaur extermination. Part 2. The US Space Force has to have a comprehensive understanding of the details of all of these different objectives that Trump is surely aware of concerning his heavily involved efforts years prior in the Middle East combating terrorism. This branch is dealing with an ever-changing and cutting-edge world, even if a lot of it is from a computer desk. It's crazy to think how long-lasting Trump's influence could be for years to come just through the Space Force. Think of where it could be 50 years from now. If you compare the kinds of planes the US Air Force had in 1954 to 2004, it sure does put a lot of things into perspective. We've already talked about a lot, and the plane we just showed you started development in the 80s. Who knows what could be in orbit in the far and distant future? Imagine a US military forward operating base in space, spacecraft with nuclear thermal, nuclear electric, or fusion-based propulsion systems, and you can thank Donald J. Trump for getting it off the ground, metaphorically and literally speaking. The scope of Trump's policymaking was expansive. While he was pushing initiatives like the Space Force, meeting with all kinds of foreign leaders, and taking care of business in the Middle East, he was keeping himself busy with the systematic reform of the US prison system. While that was happening, another Supreme Court justice had left a spot open with the retirement of Anthony Kennedy, and Trump nominated Brett Kavanaugh in 2018, who would shortly go on to prove Trump had an acumen for picking people that played the game in a smart way. In matters concerning the legal system, Trump signed the First Step Act to reform prisons. It aimed to fix federal issues, especially for nonviolent offenders. The act made several changes to federal prisons. It made the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 apply to past cases. Now, inmates could benefit from its less severe rules, namely unfair cocaine penalties. Before this point, the sentencing ratio for crack to powder cocaine was 100 to 1. This meant possessing a small amount of crack cocaine could lead to the same penalty as having 100 times more powder cocaine. The impact was harsher on African American communities. Trump's action of making the Fair Sentencing Act retroactive meant that the First Step Act allowed inmates serving sentences under the old 100 to 1 disparity had the ability to petition for a reduction in their sentences, aligning more closely with the new 18 to 1 disparity established by the Fair Sentencing Act. This meant that many inmates could see their prison time significantly reduced. Thousands of inmates benefited from the provisions. The act allowed inmates to also earn time credits for taking part in programs aimed at helping them from going back to prison again. They could earn up to 15 days of credits for each month. These credits didn't reduce their sentences, but they could move to home confinement sooner. The Department of Justice reported more educational programs and lower reoffense rates. These changes made federal prisons more focused on rehabilitation. The act notably reduced sentences for over 3,000 inmates by an average of 6 years. The act set aside $75 million each year for 5 years. This aimed to support inmate rehabilitation programs. Trump also exercised his power of presidential clemency as well, absolving these people of prison time. One way to keep people from going back to prison is stable employment. A study in the Journal of Quantitative Criminology discovered that employment reduced former inmates going back to prison by 20%. With a well-focused restructuring of the U.S. prison system, inmates could get back to normal life and into the job market, and taken up jobs the Trump administration had opened up for them. The policies Trump was responsible for were starting to pay dividends. Since they cut down on the red tape in the environmental sector back in 2017, 2018 saw a huge boom in green energy jobs. Remember those jobs we chatted about last year? Well, according to the U.S. Energy and Employment Report, around 6.7 million Americans were working in the energy sector in 2018. That's an increase of 151,700 new jobs from the year before, making up nearly 7% of all new jobs across the country. In 2018, investments in renewable energy, which Trump's Saudi relationship helped with in the US, were significant. Solar and wind energy projects led the charge. Investment in the US renewable energy sector ranged from $10 to over $100 billion annually during that period. For instance, the Solar Energy Industries Association and the American Wind Energy Association reported billions of dollars in investment in their respective sectors. So Trump had a lot on his plate. He had to boost energy production, build ties with the Saudi government for energy, and take even more steps to make America great again. As the calendar turned to 2019, the energy sector kept growing. The fuels sector grew by approximately 26,100 jobs, about 2% from the previous year, with oil and natural gas sectors again adding the most new jobs. It's not a secret the big reason Trump got on the map was the economy. He was a businessman and he knew how to get business done. But to put the breadth of his tenure into perspective, the economy was still doing well and rapidly improving while he was at the helm of all these diplomacy efforts. As 2019 rolled around, the Space Force was finally ready for launch. Kim Jong-un was putting away his launch pad, and ISIS had so many rockets launched at them, they had lost all their territory in Syria, which the Saudis liked a lot, and they were eager to keep working with the US. During this time period, the US was working hard to become a net exporter of petroleum, the product used to make what you put in your fuel tank. Gasoline. America was in that position for the first time since 1952 by 2019. And by 2019, it had exported 4.74 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. But Trump wasn't done on energy yet. In addition to all of this, his Department of Energy guy, Scott Pruitt, would pass the Affordable Clean Energy Act in 2019, putting an emphasis on an approach to renewable energy that didn't break the bank and let businesses run their businesses without strict, choking bureaucratic oversight. Over the course of his tenure as president, the number of green jobs added to the U.S. economy kept going up and up.
Careers in green energy are on the rise.
Trump had done it all at the same time. He campaigned on jobs, got people back in the energy sector, established big connections with players in the energy sector abroad, and helped them deal with their security problems as well. The economy was still in an upswing during this period too. We mentioned that Amazon had started 2017 with 566,000 employees, and now by 2019, they had 798,000. Same thing with Alphabet Inc. and their list of 80,000 people increasing to 135,000. But the growth wasn't done completely at the expense of the American public. While these businesses grew and grew, they were still subject to the rule of law. And Trump's appointed justice, Brett Kavanaugh, last year had something to say about this in Apple Inc. versus Pepper. He wrote the majority opinion in this case concerning antitrust laws. Robert Pepper and 3 other iPhone users claimed that Apple's exclusive control over app distribution for its iOS platform, alongside the 30% commission it charged, inflated prices and passed that cost on to consumers. The case wasn't over this matter specifically, as much as it was over just the ability to sue Apple for anti-competitive practices in this case. Kavanaugh ruled against Apple in a 5-4 decision, making his appointment very significant here. He argued the plaintiffs purchased apps directly from Apple and therefore are direct purchasers under Illinois BRIC. The plaintiffs alleged that Apple had unlawfully monopolized the retail market for the sale of apps and has unlawfully used its monopoly to force iPhone users to pay Apple higher than competitive prices for apps. This was a big blow to Apple from a PR perspective and established that the tech giant was not immune to the law of the land when it came to its potential vulnerabilities in the market. Kavanaugh continued, "We decline to greenlight monopolistic retailers to exploit their market position in that way." This was a big win for Trump, demonstrating his court's propensity for putting the little guy above the corporate elite. Jobs kept going and going while all of this was happening, with the pivotal turn from 2019 to 2020. According to SEC filings, 1.3 million employees surged into the job market by the end of 2020. Trump set his eyes across the border too, for business purposes, not just within the United States exclusively, but in 2020, he also leveraged his business forward thinking in deals with other countries, particularly our neighbors Canada and Mexico. He made a deliberate effort to protect American industry and promote manufacturing domestically.
I am not going to let companies move to other countries without consequence.
This was basically an update to the previously existing North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. There were new rules concerning labor provisions and the automotive industry. If you were an auto manufacturer and you didn't want any tariffs, 62.5% of your vehicle's parts needed to come from North America. Under the new provision, Trump encouraged people to build in the US, increasing this requirement to 75%. Canada also had to open its dairy market a little, keeping US dairy products at a competitive advantage comparatively. The Office of the United States Trade Representative gave an estimate that put the deal at the potential to raise US GDP by $68.2 billion, as well as adding 176,000 new jobs. A lot of this had to do with oil policy. Naturally, Trump had to roll back a ton of environmental initiatives to make any of this happen. But regardless of the effect, the numbers went up. Data doesn't lie. Trump took a large number of initiatives to get the country producing all sorts of oil-related stuff, petroleum, natural gas, and more. While this was happening, he was still working on domestic policy. He pardoned a wide range of people. A lot of them were also drug and first-time offenders. But if you didn't know already, it's in fact possible to give a pardon to a dead person, posthumously. Trump pardoned Susan B. Anthony on August 18th, 2020, on the centennial of the amendment that gave women the right to vote, the 19th. Ratified in 1920. Susan B. Anthony was a hugely important figure in the women's suffrage movement after being arrested in 1872 for voting, because women weren't allowed. She was charged and found guilty for voting. Well, okay, the term was illegally voting, but still, it's kind of funny. It actually violated laws in the books at the time. She was supposed to pay $100 and she didn't. Trump absolved her of the crime of voting. He also pardoned Kodak Black and Lil Wayne for firearms possession offenses, which is about one of the most American things one could imagine a president capable of doing. Women got more representation in matters of civic service in 2020, following the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, prompting the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett. By 2020, perhaps one of the most shocking aspects that punctuated Trump's presidency was his Supreme Court's ruling against the Republican hardline on matters of social issues, enhancing his broad appeal to those beyond his particularly strong base, showcasing his ability to reach across the aisle and get voters on a wide variety of issues. In 2020, Neil Gorsuch wrote the majority opinion in Bostock versus Clayton County, stating that the 1964 Civil Rights Act protected gay and transgender employees from workplace discrimination. Despite Trump's reputation surrounding these topics, a justice he appointed had important wording to say on a topic concerning the rights of queer people. Gorsuch wrote, quote, "An employer who fires an individual for being homosexual or transgender fires that person for traits or actions it would not have questioned in members of a different sex. Sex plays a necessary and undisguisable role in the decision. Exactly what Title VII forbids. There's a case to be made that Trump broadened his appeal here beyond his core base of hardline social conservatives, showcasing that his actual results while in office are more complex than they may initially could be predicted as. Trump's appointments could go on to sanctify his choices many years from now, keeping the Supreme Court as an example of an independent arbiter of justice. Trump also set a new precedent for the way he gathered public opinions, as well as his overall leadership style in general. His favorite app was, of course, Twitter, and like it or not, it incentivized other politicians to start using it for their online presence as well. His usage of the app was absolutely unprecedented among his peers and revolutionized the way politicians engage with the public through social media. His direct communication was great for leveraging supporters. He tweeted a lot, over 25,000 times, from when he announced his candidacy for the first time all the way back in 2015 to the end of his first term as it concluded in 2021. He had 88 million followers, one of the most for a world leader at the time. Trump had all kinds of controversial tweets. He essentially made his own equivalent of Twitter called Truth Social, showcasing the power that online congregation has in terms of leveraging people and organizing them for political purposes. Whether one sees this as a good or a bad thing, there's no denying the power of the internet when it comes to campaigning, and Donald Trump certainly proved that and gave the country a very important lesson. Ignore the ability to organize on the internet at your own political peril. He democratized the assembly process of the voting public, ensuring that everyone outside of the umbrella of the corporate elite could have their voice heard in the voting booth, regardless of what other people felt or said. His popularity grew over the course of his presidency, with an improvement from 62.98 million votes to 74 million votes, showcasing his ability as an effective campaigner. He was able to mobilize his base on top of gaining greater support overall. On his way out of the White House, Trump stayed on top of his policy of working on prisons in America, pardoning more individuals who were in prison on the basis of nonviolent or drug-related crimes as his first term finished. Donald Trump was one of the most controversial, but ruthlessly efficient big business and military power presidents in the country's history. But how bad was Trump, actually? Click the link to watch our video on how bad was Trump.